So what type of mental health issues are covered by workers' compensation, and can something like stress from a hostile work environment qualify? So mental health case, psychological, psychiatric disabilities, those types of cases nowadays are handled just like any other injury case. You can have a psychological disability that stems from an occurrence. We had a person who was a field technician who was making a call to an apartment building, and he walked up on a crime that was happening in a stairwell, and experiencing that while he was going to work at a job site gave him PTSD, and we pursued that claim. You can have an accidental occurrence that leads to a psychological injury. You can also have an occupational repetitive stress. That's not the stress of a physical injury, but you can actually have emotional stress from a repetitive stress type of scenario, like a hostile work environment. But more often than not, a psychological claim is usually a consequential injury to an underlying accident or injury. You tore your ACL in your knee and you're walking around, you're hobbling on a bad knee, and because you're hobbling on a bad knee and you're overcompensating on the good knee starts to hurt. That's a consequential injury. Well, you're walking around with all these problems and you start having psychological issues. That also is a consequential injury. So we see that happen a lot. And it also happens as a direct injury. People are involved in some pretty traumatic accidents, and having an accident can cause psychological issues, PTSD, anxiety, major depressive disorder. There's a whole wide variety of different psychological diagnoses, which we see on a daily basis. But we do see it happen more often where it's a component to a larger claim and a larger set of accidents. So what are the requirements to get psychological issues covered by workers' compensation? Does it have to be tied to a physical injury? How do you prove your case? Back in the day, in order to have a psychological injury, there must have been a physical manifestation of your psychological injury. So if you had stress, PTSD, anxiety, you name it, just having that condition was not enough. You had to have a physical manifestation, hair loss, shingles. You had to have some physical occurrence to support that the psychological injury was there. But that has changed. So yeah, it no longer has to be tied to a physical injury, but more often than not it is. We had a claim years ago where a person was working for a company and had problems with his supervisor. They had disagreements, differences of opinion, and he ultimately filed some complaints. And in the midst of the hearing processes for looking into these complaints, it got tense. It got hostile again. And this gentleman suffered a heart attack. You could see how those types of hostile work environments and tense scenarios can lead to problems, physical and psychological. And there are very good doctors out there that handle psychological claims. Just so we're clear here, there's psychologists and there's psychiatrists. Not everyone knows the difference. A psychologist generally provides cognitive behavioral therapy. You sit down and you have the discussion with, and you tell your feelings to, and that's the one that you have those types of therapy sessions with. A psychiatrist is usually the medical doctor. The psychiatrist is the one that prescribes medication, generally speaking. So in circumstances with significant psychological injuries, it could be very common for a person to see a psychologist and a psychiatrist for different types of mental therapy and maintenance of your psychological or psychiatric condition. And, you could have a diagnosed disability from either one, and you could also see both. So how do you prove a psychological or psychiatric injury? Well, if it's tied to the physical injury, if it's tied to an accident, horrible car accident, and your doctor is saying that you have PTSD, it's a lot easier. It's pretty straightforward there. You didn't have a past significant psychological history or psychiatric history. You have an accident, and now you have PTSD. You have a diagnosed psychiatric or psychological disability that is directly tied to an underlying accident. There's always a concern with the insurance company as to whether or not a person's faking it. And they don't always give you the benefit of the doubt when you're claiming a psychological or psychiatric injury, but it's certainly there, and we handle those claims all the time. If it's not tied to an actual physical injury or disability, you still pursue it the same way. If you have symptoms and you need to see a doctor, you go see a doctor. If it's a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and the doctor files medical reports just like if you broke your arm or you got into a car accident. And if that doctor is able to diagnose your disability and offer an opinion on causal relationship, that's what we use to prosecute your claim and to ultimately get your case established and get those injuries included in your claim and get your medical paid for. But they can be a little bit more difficult because they're a little harder to prove. You don't see a psychological injury. You do see a person who just had a broken arm and their arm's in a cast. Can mental health issues after your accident be considered a consequential injuries? And what if you become depressed from sitting at home unable to work? Both are true. When we're deposing, especially insurance company psychologists and psychiatrists, it's a question I frequently ask them. Can being out of work exacerbate an underlying psychiatric disability? So even if you had an underlying problem, even if you were seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist for other issues in the past before your accident, and you do have an accident and you're unable to work and you're home dealing with your injuries, can that make your underlying condition worse? And yeah, being home, being unable to work, being in pain can cause or worsen a psychological or psychiatric disability. That's oftentimes the basis of the consequential nature for these types of claims, and that's why we bring them in. Should Should most injured workers consider getting mental health treatment, and can it increase the value of your case? So I'm never going to tell somebody to go and do something simply to increase the value of your case. You should consider getting mental health treatment if you feel like you need it. And it's funny because this is actually a common question. Should I go see a psychologist? Well, you have people who think, hey, I'm doing A-okay, but I'm going to go see a psychologist because I think it might increase the value of my case. Well, if you think it's going to increase the value of your case, it might do the opposite. Because if it turns out the doctor doesn't find anything really wrong with you and the insurance company doctor doesn't find anything really wrong with you, it's going to show that you're trying to make something out of nothing, and it doesn't look very good. And by the same token, on the other end of the spectrum, there is a stigma, unfortunately, that's attached to getting psychological or psychiatric treatment and having that tag added to you in your case. It's not as bad as it used to be in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but there still is, and there probably will always be some level of stigma attached to a person who has a psychological or a psychiatric disability. And it's for that reason that a lot of people don't like to pursue it. They're afraid. They don't want to be marked with that type of issue. So I tell my clients all the time, don't be worried about it. If you need the help, go get the help. Don't worry about it. And for all intents and purposes, who's going to know about it? Me, a judge, an insurance company attorney? Nobody's out there spreading rumors about you. If you need the help, go get the help. It's certainly important to do if you need it. That being said, it's very case specific as to how it impacts value and how it impacts what we could do with a case. If you're talking about a guy with a broken arm and a broken leg, schedulable injuries that we've discussed in the past, a psychological claim takes that case out of the realm of schedule loss sometimes. Unless you go back to work, there's limited lost time. You could take what would otherwise be an SLU type of case and make it into a non-schedulable case if there's a psychological component there or a psychiatric component. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing. It's something you really need to consider, which is why it's important to have an attorney and to have a doctor, a psychologist or a psychiatrist who understands the New York State workers' compensation system, because adding a psychological or non-SLU component to a case that's otherwise an SLU type of case can really change things. What if you get cleared to return to work with a psychological or psychiatric condition, but you're not psychologically ready to return? Is there any way to stay on workers' compensation until you're ready? So again, we don't differentiate mental versus physical. If you hurt your head, neck, back, and left shoulder, and your orthopedic and your chiropractor and your surgeon all say that your head, neck, back, and right shoulder are all better, and they clear you to physically return to work, but your psychologist says that you're not ready, that's the same thing as one of your doctors that's treating one of your injuries saying you're not ready. And you still have the right to follow your doctor's instructions, just as long as it's well documented and we have the medical. They're going to try to push you. The board's going to try to push you too. They try to make light of psychological conditions and make it seem like it's not the same. It's not as severe as a physical injury and a physical disability, but you follow your doctor's instructions. You don't go back to work until your doctor clears you. As always, if you ever need anything, please call me, 212-406-8989. Rex Sikowski. We've gotten a ton of calls from people all over New York State who are looking for some help with their case, and we try to do the best we can to help everybody. If you're outside the state of New York, we do have partnerships with attorneys all across the country. If you ever need any help, give us a call. So I love you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.